Hello, welcome to today's webinar on improving lead generation marketing effectiveness and ROI. I'm Robert Drew from eMedia Lead Generation, your moderator for today's session. We're very pleased to be presenting this session today to share insights on the findings from the 2010 lead generation ROI study conducted by Lensgold Group and sponsored by eMedia. eMedia specializes in lead generation for the B2B sector. We now reach over 80 audiences from IT to CFOs to health and safety, and then some, with cost per lead, that is CPL lead generation, our specialty. We cover North America, the UK, and the Netherlands geographically. Now, for today's speakers, joining me today as the speaker is Jim Lensgold of Lensgold Group. For a few years now, the marketing profession has faced increased pressure and therefore greater opportunity to justify its endeavors, that is, to show quantifiable return on investment. Jim Lensgold has been a pioneer in the study and implementation of marketing ROI for over 20 years. As president and founder of Lensgold Group, a marketing ROI consultancy supporting clients worldwide, Jim has helped a wide variety of Fortune 1000 and emerging growth companies improve their marketing performance and profitability. He also authored the award-winning Marketing ROI, The Path to Campaign, Customer, and Corporate Profitability, published by McGraw-Hill, an outstanding book as far as I'm concerned. I read it last year myself. Given that lead generation can be one of the most measurable and productive marketing options available to the B2B world, the ROI of lead generation is a natural as a topic in terms of both value to the community and sheer interest. So I'm sure you will find value from today's webinar, Improving Lead Generation Marketing Effectiveness and ROI. And now, without further ado, Jim Lensgold.
All right. Well, thank you, Robert. And I also want to thank eMedia for the sponsorship of the research study and of this webinar, really because it wasn't just the sponsorship. There was very much a partnership, and we appreciated the help in framing the questions and really framing the topics that we were tackling this year. So, Robert, you gave background on the Lensgold Group, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. I think what you'll see when we talk through the study today and the findings is that there's definitely some good trends out there. We've looked at some specific audiences. Let me actually even jump to that. When we did our sample, we do a marketing ROI study every year, and then we break out a special module just for B2B lead generation marketers. And so this year we have dug into a couple different topics, in particular how marketers in lead gen are looking at their budget, or how they're looking at effectiveness. We've got some topics related to lead quality that we're going to cover today, and really try to put in the context of, what do we do with this information? How do we act on it? So you see there's a couple of segments we referenced periodically here that we looked at. It's much more detail in the study itself, but we looked at companies that have higher growth than their competitors. We looked at companies that define or describe their marketing as highly effective and efficient. And then we also looked at ROI users versus non-users. And again, all of this is in more detail, but what we pulled together is some highlights for today. So a question that really ended up providing some very interesting findings was how much could your profits grow if your lead generation budget were increased by 10%? Okay, so very optimistic, forward-looking view. And what was surprising to a degree is that the majority, 44%, replied don't know. Okay, so it really says a lot about the unknowns that happen in lead generation, right? I think in some ways maybe that's not incredibly surprising, but you know that by dealing with that, having to deal with that question internally, it puts us at a disadvantage in terms of our ability to get more funds. Now, if we take those people that did reply, pull out the don't knows, and focus in on that group that was able to provide a response, we've got the majority that say, 58%, that say, look, if you give me a 10% budget, I can increase my performance and generate more than 10% profits, right? So there is an upside there too, and a lot of what we're talking about today is how do we kind of close the gaps and get it to the point where don't know is less of an issue or not likely to be our response. Okay, so a little bit deeper into that one question is if we look at this group that describes themselves as highly effective and efficient, which ended up, for the past 2 years we've asked that question, it ends up right around 9% of the population. Well, some key things to look at is, one, that don't know response just doesn't really come up. So for one, these groups that are performing real well tend to at least have a good insight into what profit they can generate. And then, of course, because they've already defined themselves as highly effective and efficient, it's not surprising. But here we could see that in total, 65%, so 2 out of 3, feel confident that they could generate profits of 10% or more. And so I think you look at this and say, look, if we could start closing the information gaps, then we can get to that point where we could not only know, but we could deliver on the ROI. So to help us get into the topics of the research and what we do about this, I always like to start with that understanding of what's driving ROI. So if we look at the typical customer funnel where we might be marketing to 1,000 and a portion of those get generated as leads that we're going to pass into a sales organization. Well, out of that, we know a portion will close, so there'll be some incremental sales, and a portion may drive most of our profitability because they repeat purchase and they continue on. So if we look at these key drivers, we've got a lot of tactics that we're using to generate those leads. That's going to drive our investment, so we want to know what happens there. We've got that sales conversion, right? Because if we generate those leads and we don't get any revenue out of them, there's no ROI. So now we've got to know that, look, if they're not good quality leads and they leak out, that's not of value to us. And how valuable the customer is once they start buying. So the low value clients are going to cost us more potentially than the profits we gain. So if we take that and decide, all right, it's all about getting insights and eliminating this don't know as to what the performance could be, then the pieces we're most interested in is what is that tactical effectiveness out of all those areas we're spending money. What can we learn about lead quality? How do we get ourselves to the position where we can at least put on paper the ROI potential? And then to help support that, what are the measurement and ROI practices that help enable that? And so we can start tackling them a piece at a time. And that really kind of sets the stage for our discussion today. So in terms of the insights into effectiveness, we've got some additional research here, and we'll share some thoughts as well. So we were asked, we kind of ranked these in terms of the level of sophistication, and in this chart it's working from the bottom up. But as terms of how do they track and assess lead generation and the performance of this tactic. So if you look, 20% have no tracking, but the big winner here is that most companies are crediting the last touch point as the source of the lead, and when they do the evaluation and they compare different leads, that's the one that gets the credit. Now you can see there's another portion, 21%, they're splitting that across multiple touch points, which is addressing a reality that we know is important. And these top two tier ones, the more sophisticated ones, market testing and modeling, were certainly used by fewer. Now in this case, what we have here is in this chart, we're splitting the high growth and the slower growth companies, and that's their view of growth over the course of the next year relative to competitors. And here you see the higher growth companies are certainly at least getting some increment above the slower growth companies in terms of their use of market testing and modeling. And the slower growth companies are dependent a bit more on or not even dependent on, they're just not even doing tracking. So we could at least make some connection to the growth levels. And I think in the report there was a couple other areas that stood out there too. But I think growth is always an important one to look at. And if we think about, what do we do with this, and how do we evaluate where we're at relative to where we want to be? And so first, we'll just establish that measurement in the lead generation world is complicated. There are many touch points, and we expect that there's a cumulative effect and not just comparing one initiative versus the others. So here's how we view those measurement techniques, right? So what we consider good techniques, not putting them down in any way, are this idea of the last touch attribution, okay? So if we're using that, what it does is it should give a relative comparison of tactics and surface the most effective ones. This process of splitting credit across multiple touch points is good. In ways, it actually simulates what sometimes happens within a correlation analysis. But the area you have to be careful about here is there's a degree of subjectivity. So do we divide everything equally? Do we put weights on some versus the other? And that's where you have to be careful, because you could lose the integrity of when you're reporting. Do people believe it? And are you consistent in the way you use it? What's better, though, is those top-tier ones. And we have a couple more slides to talk about that in more detail. But when we look at modeling, this has got a good scientific approach, and as long as we have good data, we could look across all the touch points and at least give assessment of how they're contributing, even if some of those tactics are not response-oriented, right? So when you're running some mass media support, that should have a lift, and modeling is very good at detecting that. Now, market testing, another very good and reliable technique. The difference is with market testing, what we end up doing is isolating one component, or we could run market tests that are more sophisticated, but we're identifying the with and without. So whether we're adding a tactic into the mix or adding an offer within a tactic, or looking at one integrated set of tactics versus another, right? So very good at comparisons. We define it, and almost in some ways more reliable than modeling, but not as comprehensive. Okay, so let's look at some outputs and some examples here. So when we're talking about modeling, we could be talking about very sophisticated marketing mix models. We could talk about correlation analyses. To a degree, you could even do data mining, but let's kind of keep it at the level where there's some statistical techniques that we could rely on. And so if we look at sales over a period of time, we can work it back. And in this case, this example here, we not only look at some of the tactics we have off to the side here, but let's see if I could bring up some tools. So our tactics are in the mix and how much they contribute. But if the data is there, we could look at outside factors, economics. There are some trends in the market that are not, that our industry may be growing or declining, and those that need to get pulled out, and even some competitive activity, right? And so we're talking about sales, and once we have sales, we could look at the spend that we spent on each of those channels and the return, and we could look at an ROI. Okay, so there's the potential to get to that level. And one other thing to keep in mind is if we look down here, the same analysis can work, and we could be substituting leads in here relative to sales. And there's a kind of a plus and a minus here that we wanted to keep in mind. One is that in some cases, if we have long sales cycle or we have issues within the pipeline, our accuracy will actually improve because we can build better correlations between the marketing activity and the lead being generated. And again, one of our goals is to understand that multiple touch and what each one is contributing as part of the mix, right? So if we pull, in this case, if we pull newspapers out, we'll lose 123 sales, but all these other touch points are generating contribution there. So the plus side of looking at leads is the accuracy could be better. The downside is that the model is only looking at the outcome of a lead, and when we leave lead quality out of here, we could be generating lots of leads that are lower value, lower quality, not likely to convert, and now all of a sudden we don't have a good correlation that we could tie to the financials. But that's not to rule that process out, because this is where if we had a model that went to leads and it was on a per channel basis, we could at least get some indication if lead quality varies by the response source. So sometimes we're using measurements by pulling information together from multiple sources. So let's not rule that out. I think we've got a good potential there, and certainly modeling needs to be introduced at a higher level. Now, market testing, hopefully most of you are familiar with it, but if not, we'll cover the basics here. And what we're basically saying is if we could establish some control group that may have many tactics, but is not having this one initiative that we've defined, so where we've set there's one initiative, one tactic we're going to introduce into the mix, and it's going to cost us $150,000. When we compare that control group versus our target, what we see is, we could look at gross margin, we could look at all the outputs, but obviously because they're not the same size, we're not going to compare them. So what we do is create the adjusted control, and that's where we carry over the target size and basically say, had we performed only the marketing that was within the control group, we'll carry over those results. So we'll get a certain conversion rate, we'll get a certain revenue per customer, gross margin might vary, didn't in this case, and now we've got a comparison that says, look, this is with and without. And so if we take that $150,000 and we look at an incremental sales of 640 new customers or new units, we also, in this case, marketing also generated incremental value per customer, which is great. So if we run those numbers out, we could see that we generated an incremental $183,000 in gross margin, which is better than our marketing contribution. And right there, we've got that positive ROI. Okay, so the control group, again, all we're trying to do is make sure we're getting a good representation of what would have happened in the absence of one particular marketing initiative. Okay, so back to our research study and where we're at, what some of the questions we posed. So we did look and just ask the opinions of lead generation marketers to figure out, what do they see as the top priority of steps they could take that would bring the insights necessary to improve lead generation, right? So basically what happened is, the big winners here tended to be more towards the basics. And I guess if we're looking at a lot of companies that are not sure of what the profit potential is, this is where the needs are. So in this case, getting the tracking to show lead conversion to sales was pretty high. And that highlights that issue between marketing and sales of not closing the feedback loop, right? And the other one was a broad one we put in there, and it did score fairly well, 24%, where, what we really need to know is the acquisition channels that we have to work with, which ones are most effective. Okay, and then it got a little bit more sophisticated there. We asked a question, a very similar question, but we asked, what about lead generation with current customers? How do we, what information do we need to help that out? So very similar. The top ranking one is really to know now the measures to show the lift, but in this case, it is a bit more challenging with existing customers, as we have to now separate out repeat sales and retention, where acquisition's a little cleaner. They weren't buying before, now they're buying. Here, what we need to know is that incremental lift. And what was interesting, though, for this question in particular, people who are using ROI metrics, when we compared those to the group that uses non-financial metrics only, what happened is that they obviously must be doing much better on some of these more broad tactics initiatives, because what they ranked as the highest is they're looking at how do I measure the long-term benefits initiatives such as retention marketing. So much more difficult, but again, hopefully because they're using ROI, their measurements are a little bit more sophisticated. So in terms of now, that the measurements are a big part of this if we're going to get insight, but we also have to look closer at lead quality, and this has shown up in a number of our studies. I think in some ways we saw some figures that were somewhat positive here. But we looked at lead quantity, and then we looked at different dimensions of lead quality. So lead quantity we knew was important. In fact, if we look at the people who claim to be highly effective and efficient and compare them to all others, we see it's pretty close. So lead quantity is no question that belongs there. And everyone was able to check off as many of these as was relevant. So those using lead quality, though, where this big gap was in terms of effective versus all others, the highly effective, really comes, and in fact these top two are both related to understanding customer revenue, the revenue side. So in this case we look at lead quality based on the initial sale, and in the next one, lead quality over customer revenue over time. So again, those people, those that identify themselves as highly effective and efficient, can at least get the initial sale and are doing fairly well at that value over time. All right. Oh, I need to get my pointer back here. Okay. And a slide I've used in the past to help kind of articulate what we mean by lead quality and why this is so important is that we look at the averages, right? So we bring in leads in, and this is in the situation where we're fortunate enough to get some feedback. But if we find leads that are generating and closing 7% into sales, and we look at that total value of the customer, we could assess that at $4,000. We can work our way back. There's a formula at the bottom here. Work our way back to figure out that we could spend no more than $224, right? Because we're going to generate $28,000 for every leads we generate once we multiply that out, or for every 100 leads. So so we can work our way back, but if we work off these averages, we're really missing a lot of good information, and sometimes it's even counterintuitive. So in this example here, where we are looking at different conversion rates and different values, we just broke it down to 3 segments, we can see that in some situations where segment A has higher value, because they close at a lower conversion rate than segment B, they're actually likely to generate less, right? Making all things equal per 100 leads. Conversely, or further, look at this as that segment C, where the conversion rate is just slightly lower, the profit's slightly lower. It drops dramatically. So that spending level and where we invest our money becomes quite significant. And in a lot of cases, you know, if we've got segment C blended in there, that means we're actually spending more than we are generating back for those clients if we're working off the average. So this is what keeps us focused to say, look, we always have to be looking at lead quality. This is what's going to drive our ROI. Another interesting fact, so we're talking about lead quality, but we're also then looking at the look back at the tactics. So here we asked a question to rate on a 5-point scale how effective different tactics were specifically for driving high-value leads that convert to sales. So if we look at that, and these are the top 2 ratings, what was interesting is how much these educational and engaging tactics scored very high in terms of being effective at driving those right leads, those higher quality leads. So topping the list was webinars, but closely following that was e-newsletters. We do have one here that's engaging customers through product trials, and then also the white papers and ebooks, right? And so we want to make sure that as we're looking at this, we are focusing in, because obviously we've got to make sure we've got the right tactics in place. But one of the pieces we want to keep in mind is that as we get more sophisticated and we could look at lead quality, not just quantity, you know, this is where we might be able to prove out that educational programs or engaging programs do more than just generate a name. They actually help the sales process. And so if we could do that, you know, the better the quality, the fewer leads we need to actually get our programs to pay out. Another good finding that is very beneficial here and really interesting, especially we've seen it 2 years in a row now, is we asked a question in terms of a rating to say, you know, for which of these areas of marketing is your budget too low relative to the profit potential? Okay, so really we're looking for that untapped profit potential. Why are we not, certain areas we're not getting funded? And for 2 years now, nurturing stalled leads has topped that list. I think we could attribute that to a couple things that we know from interacting with many different companies. And one is, it is harder to make the case for lead nurturing because you've got a little bit more of a longer-term investment. You've got leads that weren't ready to buy, and now what do you do with them? So that's probably one area that might be driving the underfunding. But the second one is that these other areas, if you look at them, they tend to get more attention, and you have to assume that, yes, maybe we're not fully funded, but we should at least be able to you know, we've got money going into these, so we know we're generating lead volume, we know we're generating quality leads and looking to improve sales conversions, but we're not getting that commitment and the buy-in to do something a little bit more sophisticated in terms of nurturing the stalled leads. So I want to pull this out. I think when you put some of these pieces together, it becomes very interesting. So I've labeled that the opportunity alert. And that is, if you look at lead nurturing and say this is underfunded, also look back to the slide just prior, where we talked about engaging and educating customers as tactics that are very good at generating those high-quality leads. Those also, by the nature of a nurturing program, are what tend to fit real well. They're very conducive to supporting a nurturing program where the lead's not ready to buy, but to keep them engaged and interested, we've got to have some form of contacts and tactics. So whether that's the webinars and e-newsletters, or even when you get into white papers and e-books, it's all informing the potential customer and hopefully making it so that when they're ready to buy, they not just come back and buy from you, but they actually buy more, become more profitable, stay longer. So if we tie this together and try to make some conclusions and look at actions we could take, where does it come in and lead quality? So one of the pieces we have to do is make sure this works between the marketing and sales organization. So what I've listed here is if we're going to negotiate and try to get buy-in, what we need as marketers from the sales team is the feedback loop. Okay? Tell us what leads are good quality, which ones aren't. Tell us which leads convert to sales. Give us information on that incremental customer value that we're driving. And another area we haven't talked too much about, but this idea of leakage analysis, which helps us if leads do not convert, which usually there's a fair amount of them, where in the sales process do they drop out? If it's very early, then we're not screening effectively enough. If they get very far through the process and late in that sales pipeline, they drop out, then what we have to do is look at either educating those customers differently or looking for ways to support the sales team. Okay, so this is what we're asking the sales team to do. And in return, what we can offer to the sales team, what marketing will deliver, is lead screening, which could be a formal scoring process, could be an informal scoring process. But the idea that if we hand fewer leads but they're better, usually has a pretty good payback in terms of the ROI. The lead source evaluation, in other words, we'll actually help to not just do the screening based on the lead that came in, but if we know some of the criteria that sales is using to disqualify them, we'll actually enhance and do that. And really the most important thing is as we start looking at the ROI potential and using that feedback, our goal with marketing is then to use that information to increase the conversion rates, increase the customer value. Again, come back to educating and engaging, not just pitching and selling, but actually helping the clients to figure out how they will use the solutions we deliver. Right? So think about it. That summarizes it right there. Right? We could deliver this because we've got better educated customers. We've got them more engaged. If we've done this right, that whole interaction with these different tactics actually should be a value-added experience so that we are coming across as helpful, we're not pitching, we're actually giving away content, and that should be a differentiator as well. If we also do this right, we now have alignment in the marketing and sales message, so we're nurturing and building a relationship that should continue on. And the other piece that definitely has value within the mix when we're talking about educating and engaging is that we should be bringing in customer intelligence that the sales team can use. So we know from white papers and webinars and e-books that if these contacts have downloaded this type of information, that should help in the sales process to increase conversions. All right, so a nice way to think about that is, look, we're saying that if we could get this better, the process better, we'll deliver leads that are more than just a list of names. We could definitely get people further into that purchase funnel. So we've hit a couple of our key topics, that idea of measurement and the idea of looking at lead quality. And so let's put into a context that says, how do we want to see this managed? And we'll go through this, and then we're going to open it up for your questions shortly. So if you haven't already, please submit questions in, and we'll address those. So the ROI management process, if we look at marketing first, right, our process of setting objectives, developing that strategy, getting to the tactics, and then putting our marketing out there in such a way that it makes an impact. So where we want to see the ROI fall into this is to make sure we're putting ROI scenarios up front and to the point where it not only shapes the tactics, but it actually can influence the objectives and the strategy that we're going to come through. And perhaps as we do that the first time, we might have to use good assumptions. But if you think about it, the ability to even put that scenario on paper, that would at least let us have a dialogue with the executives who are asking, What can you do with 10% more budget? Next piece of the process is the measurement plan, okay? And that's where we want, the most important thing we can do is bring that up to the point where the strategy and tactics are being developed, whether that's a long-term plan or whether it's a campaign plan. And the reason we need to do it up front is that we are very much aligned to the objectives that that we have for the campaign, but sometimes we have to build some variation into the plan, right? Test markets, in some ways, if you could design the campaign differently, the modeling will be more valuable, or even the tracking mechanisms. We then are saying that an important part is measurements. Not that we're going to measure everything, but we're going to put effort behind measuring the pieces that are most important. And in our case, that is inclusive of that feedback loop from the sales team that gives us a little bit more insight than just getting to the point of a lead. As we get those results in terms of the lift and the value, we now could plug it into the ROI on the back end and get some assessment. That is what leads us into the back to the what do we do differently, so it leads us back to the next cycle of marketing. It also builds a history so that, now when we go to play in the next one, our ROI scenario is richer. We're just actually figuring out what to do different. How do we get that insight to help us out there? All right, so let's break this down into taking action and using that framework we just presented here, right? And if you think about it, if nothing else, for some of us, that goal has to be we have to get past don't know. And think about it. It's, the odds of someone walking down the hall and saying, what can you do with 10% more budget is probably not even as likely as asking, what's the impact if you're going to get 10% less budget? So there is urgency here. We're under a lot of pressure still today, and we've got to get, not perfect answers, but we have to get to the point that we can have a reply in place, right? So think about these things that we can do. One, let's make sure we get into the discipline of showing the ROI potential. It makes the business case, whether we're asking for more money, defending what we have, or even trying to get more out of what we have. And in a sense, that should quantify our strategy. That here's what we're going to spend, here's what we expect in terms of lead outcomes, and here's our assumptions for how that converts into revenue for the company. Even to the point where we can say, look, and here's what we think is even a better strategy, but if you look at my scenario here, I'm going to generate fewer leads. They're going to be higher conversion because I've put more effort into that education and engagement. Let's make the case, and then we'll get some support to track it and measure it. And that is the second bullet here. We're going to test and measure in order to not just assess and improve, but when we are making the case for especially more budget, we really need to say we could do this on a small scale, get your buy-in, and scale it. So the third point there is let's earn that incremental budget. If we believe, we should be always looking for where the profit potential is. Once we identify it, we should back it up with the ROI scenario and get people to buy it. And again, the testing helps on a small scale as well. We want to make sure that even with the budget we have today, we've got to have some level of measurement discipline. Can't measure everything, but if we could keep information flowing, we've got to get into that mode of continuous improvement. And that's the idea that demonstrates we could manage marketing with that approach. What do we look for that helps us do better? And we've got to close some of the gaps there. And so to highlight some of the opportunities that we see out of the research collectively, right? So the very time-sensitive, or not time-sensitive, the acting on this information and thinking about where we go. Number one on our list is we want to make sure that we could build some insights on lead quality, but that we also know how to use them. And so we've covered a couple key points there. We really put a lot of emphasis on the education and engagement. If you saw those tactics came out very strong. But we've also got pieces of research that suggest those have high potential, and they really need to work with the promotional aspects, right? So sometimes there is time-sensitive offers and more of the traditional promotions out there that get people to act. So let's make sure we tie those pieces together. Look, if we're measuring that last touch attribution, we're in pretty good shape, but we really want to look past that. And that might not mean we do it for everything, but that we pull out some modeling and analysis once in a while to understand that multiple touch and the interaction effects, that we put market tests in place to really start answering some bigger questions and make that more strategic. and make sure that we just have that measurement discipline. And there's a lot of opportunity there that really doesn't get tapped into. And in fact, there's number 4, identify untapped profit opportunities for improving effectiveness. And this is the idea of really looking for weaknesses that exist today. I always love to point to the funnel first, but I think, one of the things that I think a lot of people in marketing lead gen believe and can't prove out is that idea of nurturing. So look at that, and we have an article on our website we just published on that talks about how do you assess and how do you put the business case together for that. And then the last one is, look, lead generation has a lot of profit potential here, and in fact, those people that do have enough information to report it, more than half are saying that the profits, there's a real high upside. So let's make sure that we make it more effective, but let's also make sure we get the commitment and buy-in from both the executive side and from the sales organization, right? So it's definitely a good part of the process, a necessary one in the B2B world, so let's make the most of it. All right, so Robert, I'm going to hand it back to you to see what questions we have in mind. If you're there, Robert, you might have us on mute. All right, let's see. I am going to look through the questions myself because I got a message here that Robert dropped off. All right, let me pull up some questions. Give me just a moment here. And here we go. Okay. Well, the first question is a relatively easy one. Will I make the slides available at a later point? So I can answer that one as I flip through and look for some more. The we will, if you want a PDF of the presentation, send an email to us at info@lensgold.com. Okay, we'll turn that around for you today. We have recorded the session, so we will, assuming the quality came out okay, we will be posting that. And I'm going to just look through, and I'm just going to randomly pick out a few of the questions here. What are new or most effective ways companies are tracking lead sources and the profits generated by each source, manually versus software, et cetera? So that's a good one. And actually, in terms of the tracking, so think about it from a couple key points. So in most situations where there's a good sales automation system, right? That could be CRM, it could be the Salesforce.com. What we see is a mix of uses there. So the technology is there that if the sales team cooperates, you not only will get good information on the sale outcome, so how many converted to a sale, you should get at least the initial purchase value, so that's typically tracked. Now that might be at a revenue level, in which case you'll have to do a little bit of financials to convert it to profit, but that's still a fair enough assumption. And it not only gives you that, it will detail out the leakage point. So if your leads are only getting to the first or second or third stage in the sales pipeline, then you will then obviously you want to know that you get that feedback. The real issue is that compliance. It's the very often what we see is that the sales team is working to or is doing just what they need to manage their own leads, and there's no motivation to put the tracking in place to feed back to marketing. They're not using it, they don't need it. What we recommend is, if you go back to that one slide, we were saying, look, if we say this is what we want from the sales organization, this is what we'll give to the sales organization. Whether they'll buy it on faith or not is a big issue, but in the case where you're running into barriers, what we generally recommend is that you run this on pilots. So ask a small team, a group of the sales force, to improve the tracking and show that you can act on it. So show the analysis of what you find out of that. Okay. All right. Let's see if I can pull up another question here. Any good ideas how to get ROI from leads sent to distributors and tie it to distributors' direct orders? That's a great question. So Julie sent that one in. So what the issue here? Let's back up. So the issue is when you are in a lead generation mode, you could have one of two things. Either you could have third parties generating leads for you and using your co-op dollars, or you could be generating leads and the sales team, in a sense, that is outsourced, in that you're dealing with channel partners. And so there tends to be this bigger black box than this void of information than you'd have in your own sales team. So here's a couple things that we've seen and recommended, and they're quite diverse here. So one, in some situations, it works where you can partner with the channel partners and say, look, we are going to run this marketing initiative to generate leads. What we need from you is the support and the feedback to tell us whether it's worth us, in a sense, spending these co-op dollars to generate leads for you. The feedback is a win-win. The issues you sometimes run into is those channel partners in some businesses are much more protective of their data. They may be representing you and many other companies, and they don't want to know they don't want to let you know the details. Second category that tends to work well, not always without issues, but an approach that you look for, and that is that matchback process, right? So what you have is we generate the leads, we hand off the names, let's look at a typical sales cycle period 3 to 6 months later and do some level of matchback. The biggest issue there is how do we make sure that the name over here from this company does or does not match with a different name from the same company. So I'll give you a general rule, and of course, every situation is somewhat different. But what we generally look for as a starting point is if you can match company and geographic location, it's kind of a good middle point, because if you match company, some of these big companies, you market to them and generate a lead, someone else from the company is buying. There's not a good connection there. So it overstates it. If you track personal names, then there's other people in the buying decision process, and it understates it. So at least that idea of matching a company and location get you pretty close. There are more sophisticated techniques you could use, but at least that's one. And the third category I'd put in this one when you're dealing with some type of distributor or channel partner is, if it can work for you, is to set requirements that say, look, the companies that give us feedback and can demonstrate that they're closing the leads or that are giving feedback on the quality of the leads will get more leads. And so that only works if you're generating a lead that people consider value. So there's three categories there that I think you could keep in mind. All right, so let me pick another one here. Do you use net present value to calculate your ROIs? So for that one that came in from Dave, absolutely. And I think to even set that up, what's important is that we look at leads not just at that initial sale, but how they're likely to, the value that they're likely to provide within a reasonable period of time. Meaning, if we could get customers that buy small but grow quickly, they are potentially more valuable than someone coming in to buy once a reasonable amount, but they buy once and disappear. Right? So the idea that those customers that are better fit with us, and this is where that education sometimes shows up too, they're more likely to stay and repeat buy. So anytime we're looking at revenues and profits coming in over a longer period of time, we should discount it back to a net present value. If it's under a year, you would just probably use the same process that finance would use for other parts of the business. If it's over a year, you almost always have to do some level of net present value. And let's see if I can find one more here that is reasonable, and then we'll wrap things up. All right. Well, this one's a pretty broad one. I'll put it out there and see what comes out. But can you share any new or innovative ways of generating leads? And I'm probably going to have to twist that in terms of the context of what we're looking for here. But I would say that that if we put a couple pieces together, if we talk about the potential tactics, which has come up a bit here, I think the opportunity to take these educational tactics, and if we put the pieces together that say, look, someone shows up at an event or a webinar or a white paper or even our newsletter, the fact that they click through and read certain articles, to me the piece that works very well, and it doesn't get implemented as often because of the complexity, but is to take the fact that there's an engagement there and that we captured intelligence, and that should guide our next contact with them and how we treat them, so that if we did this right, we could put newsletter articles together that help us bucket buyers into cost-conscious, into high-end services, into comparative shopping. And so if we use content smarter and we capture that feedback, the biggest driver of ROI is always targeting, and that's finding the right customers and then delivering that right message to get them to convert. And this is the type of information that really lets us step up and do more. And there's always new tactics coming out there, but if it's how we put it together and use information that will make the difference, right? Because you'll spend less on fewer people, but they'll convert at a better rate. So, all right, let me. I think we just had one more question in. Other than that, I think we might wrap it up. But let's see. Was anything discovered in regards to the improvement of close rates when using lead nurturing or longer sales cycle environments, longer sales cycle environments? And I'd have to answer, honestly, out of the study, obviously the questions always, the responses to the questions always lead to next questions. And so we don't have something that connects the nurturing and the close rates. This is something that I think what we've tried to establish is that, look, that's our rationale going into a nurturing program, that we should be able to increase close rates, and especially over a long sales cycle, you need to keep those clients engaged. But I don't, in fact, I'd even question whether there's, if we were doing a general survey of B2B lead generation marketers, out of that population, do we have enough that are, one, doing good lead nurturing programs, and two, have the tracking and evaluation in progress that they can report on that. I would love to know the information as well. In fact, I would welcome if there's anyone out there that has some information. We'll find a way to post it in a blog or find some way to get it out there. So we're right at 50 minutes or so. I think we had some great Q&A. I appreciate that. I will open up the invitation to say that anyone that has a follow-up question, if you'd like to send it to info@lenschool.com, we'd be more than happy to follow up. And there's the research study that's posted on our website, a few articles related to that, and we are about to release actually it might be out there now, a lead nurturing ROI tool that's available on the website for free too. So that will be posted shortly, and again, welcome the future comments, and thank you all for participating in it. And I'll thank you on behalf of Robert Drew that had to drop off unexpectedly. Thank you.